Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and I'm talking today with Imogen Ragone, who is an Alexander Technique teacher and website designer in Wilmington, Delaware. And our topic is going to be the Alexander Technique and the scientific method. And for this podcast, Imogen's going to interview me. So, Imogen, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Very interesting
Well,
topic.
well thank you
So let
for volunteering to,
well,
to the interview.
okay.
Yes.
How much choice I had, I'm not sure. No, I'm just kidding. All right, so let's just start off with the kind of two basic questions. The first being, what is the Alexander technique? Just a very brief definition or description would be helpful.
Sure. I would define the Alexander technique as a way of learning how to physically employ ourselves, as it were, in doing the things we do through life that takes advantage of our basic structure and takes advantage of the various forces that operate on us on planet Earth. For example, gravity, support, atmospheric pressure, that sort of thing. So how can we use our bodies, our body minds, if you like, as efficiently and as effectively as possible in doing whatever we've chosen
Doing
to do?
okay, great. And so that's the Alexander technique. What is, or can you describe what the scientific method is for
Right. Now
us?
that's going to be a little trickier. There is actually no one totally agreed upon definition of it or description of it, but I want to read a short dictionary a definition that I pulled off the internet that I think captures the basic idea. That is, I'm quoting, a method of procedure that has characterized natural science since the 17th century, consisting in systematic observation, measurement, and experiment, and the formulation, testing, and modification of hypotheses.
Hmm.
And it's not a bad definition. It's really saying if you're going to investigate something, you want to find out how something works or what the effect of one thing on something else is. It's really good to be as objective as possible.
Right.
So, and I think, I don't know in England, but in America, we learned about this idealized version in high school science classes. Did you
Well,
encounter that?
I remember in science classes at school we had a very particular way. We had to write up our science, and it started with equipment, hypotheses, equipment, method. I don't know. There was all. It was a very, and I'm thinking it was maybe a simplified form of
Hmm. Well,
uh, the
that is, yeah,
scientific method.
right.
Ending with conclusion. So,
Right, and
yeah,
the idea is that the conclusion should be based on objective
right.
measurements, and the scientific method is it really permeates all of science, certainly the hard sciences,
Hmm.
very much to this day. Now, it is a somewhat idealized view, and uh, in the last few years, some scientists have said, and there has been some evidence for the idea that sometimes the scientists may think they're being objective, but they unconsciously allow their biases to creep in.
Hmm.
So, for example, if you're measuring something and there's a lot of different readings and you're kind of doing a trend line of some kind, you might even quite unconsciously knock off some of those measurements that seem to go against what you would think is probably
Mm.
the right answer. And there's some evidence that that happens sometimes in science.
Okay.
But so that's one thing. And the other possibility is a scientist actually fabricating data. And we have had some examples of that. And when it is exposed, it's seen as a very, very bad thing to have done. And it's a
Well,
great
yes. Yeah.
it's a great way to lose your tenured your
Sure.
status in the in the scientific world. You can get kicked out of your job, and it's not a good thing. And there have been a few well publicized cases of that over the years. One of the reasons why that can be exposed so easily today is that when someone does publish results of an experiment, it's out there for everyone to instantly try themselves. And if a lot of people have trouble replicating it, then
Right.
questions are asked. Um, that unconscious that unconscious bias can take a lot of forms. I mentioned, knocking
Yeah.
outliers
Hmm.
out. But there's an interesting, this is a little off topic, but I
Hmm.
do think it's kind of an interesting example of an early version of that. There was some guy in the 19th century who wanted to measure people's intelligence by his theory was brain size was the thing to measure, and the way to measure it was to get skulls and fill them full of buckshot, and then the ones that you put got more buckshot in, those were the smarter people, right? And he was interested in particular in blacks versus whites.
Oh dear.
Yeah, and he came up with the conclusion that blacks had smaller brains, therefore less intelligent. Apart from the problem of brain size being the measure, there was another thing that went on is that when was putting the buckshot in the white skulls, he would tamp it down a little more. And the reason we know that is that we have the actual skulls that he used,
Oh, wow.
and the experiment was replicated, and there was no difference. This is in
Of
recent,
course. Yeah.
last
Yeah.
10
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
15 years. So that kind of thing can happen.
Hmm.
Um, but generally speaking, the scientific method is considered pretty sacrosanct,
Right.
if that's the right word in
So kind
science.
of like the gold standard
It
for
really is the
for
gold
conduct.
standard, and
Yeah.
I should say here, sort of full disclosure, in a distant past, I myself was a scientist who was doing experiments
Mhm.
that
And
obviously
using the scientific method, presumably.
using the scientific method,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes.
But those
So, yeah.
days are long past.
Okay. Um, so, in terms of our kind of discussion today,
Hmm.
did Alexander, the founder of what we know as the Alexander technique today, did he actively use the scientific method to make his discoveries? What do you think
I
about that?
think I think the answer is basically yes. I think his use of mirrors. I think you have to understand the situation that he was up against. He had trouble with his voice. He decided to check it out for himself to see what was going on, and use mirrors. And what he you could say he discovered was that there were three things. There was what he thought he was doing, there was what he felt he was doing, and what he saw that he was doing in the mirror.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he was correct in making the assumption that what he saw was not conditioned by previous experience and was probably the more accurate one.
Mm-hmm.
So, in that sense, absolutely, I think he was using the scientific method.
And he
Uh,
was following the kind of procedural.
Well, I
Um,
don't think he was following. Well, he was testing hypotheses for
mhm,
sure. And
yeah.
in fact, if you read that the famous chapter, Evolution of a Technique, the first chapter in use of the self, there is a sentence in there which Marjorie Barstow used to always say was the most important sentence,
Mhm.
which is something to the effect, there's not space here to cover all the things I tried that didn't work.
Uh-huh,
But
right.
he does give some examples of things that didn't work so well or worked a little bit. Clearly, he was experimenting.
Hmm.
I Probably he wasn't explicitly aware of the quote scientific
Hmm.
method that we've been discussing, but I think in essence he was.
Hmm.
On the other hand, we have to also understand that his account in use of the self
Yes.
is not probably not an accurate account of what actually went on, in the sense that things didn't proceed exactly as he put him there.
So
Um,
are you saying sort of the essence is what happened, but the way it's organized for writing in the book is maybe a bit more,
right. Well,
um,
yes,
or
and
more than that?
yes, I think there's an Alexander teacher, Neville Short, who's a Alexander teacher in Glasgow. And I think his take on it is really interesting.
Hmm.
That, yeah, probably not accurate in terms of the exact sequence that happened at the time,
Hmm.
but that when Alexander was writing about it in the early 30s, I guess, for use of
Hmm.
the self, it was what he wanted people to what he wanted to be out there as a good methodology,
Right.
and in a very broad sense the methodology he used, but he sort of, I think, edited things to
Hmm.
make it fit in more with the method. And in fact, I should have mentioned this earlier. um, John Dewey, who was one of his famous
Hmm.
students,
Yes.
uh, I'm gonna just pull out a couple of phrases from his discussion of Alexander's method that originally he put in the preface to, or introduction to, constructive conscious
Hmm.
control, but then repeated some of it for use of
Hmm.
itself. And I'll just give a couple of phrases he uses. Mr. Alexander's teaching is scientific in the strictest sense of the word, and then the plan of Mr. Alexander's satisfies the most exacting demands of scientific method.
Mm.
And I think a key word there is the word plan. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if Dewey and Alexander were talking about this, and Alexander said, "Well, Dewey said, well, there is this thing called the scientific method, and might make your case stronger if you presented your discovery in accordance with
In
that."
those
I'm
terms,
just
yeah.
speculating here, but um, I think in essence that was a procedure that he wanted people to understand, and that he wanted in a way to be an underlying basis of
Yeah.
how the work was taught. And so I would say yes, he did,
Good.
he did. Um, but we have to take some of the details with a grain of salt, because unlike scientists today, who when they publish their studies publish everything meticulously, I
Hmm.
did this and this, and when I changed this, I did, really specific, and it's put out in a way. It's not supposed to be what happened, what they wanted to write after it happened. It's supposed to be
Right.
what
Yeah.
actually
He
happened.
didn't actually
Yeah,
uh,
he didn't
like we
fulfill
did
that
doing our
part
lab
of it.
reports at school. He wasn't noting the data and
No,
putting it
no.
as he did it. That yeah,
On the other
in that
hand,
sort of way. In that.
right. But on the other hand, we do have to cut him some slack because when he was actually doing all this stuff, he had no idea that was going to be an Alexander technique.
Exactly. Exactly.
So
No, I think it's
I'm
wonderful.
prepared to cut him a
Yeah.
lot of slack on that. I think he was essentially following the protocols of the scientific method as well as he could under the circumstances.
Right.
Given what he knew and what he had access to in terms of measuring devices, I think he did pretty well.
He certainly did.
He certainly
So,
did, and we
uh,
all owe him a great deal.
indeed.
He clearly was influenced by other people. I think that's pretty clear now. We also know that the working out this procedure he's talking about and taking it into teaching or using it for his own self in teaching did not take the 9 or 10 years that some teachers like to put on their websites. We're talking about somewhere between a year and a half and 2 years, maybe, uh, in terms of time.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think he was
It's
using the
still quite a
scientific.
long time to
It's a
be
long time.
working on watching yourself and
Yeah,
yes, experimenting. So
absolutely.
for this interview, I know you've got some more things that we're going to talk about in a
Hmm.
kind of second interview on
Yeah.
this subject, but is there anything else you'd like to mention in relation to this first interview on Alexander technique and the scientific method?
No, I think we've covered what I wanted to talk about as far as FM himself.
Okay.
And then part two of this, our next podcast will be bringing this into today's world
Yeah.
and asking about the scientific method and is it being applied in Alexander teaching today.
Yeah. So come back soon for
Come,
part two, right?
absolutely, part
Yeah.
two. And
Okay.
so I'll just close this out by saying that my guest and interviewer today has been Imogen Ragone, an Alexander Technique teacher in Wilmington and website designer in Wilmington, Delaware. And I'll put a link to her site by this interview. I'll also put a link to a site that will tell you how to find an Alexander teacher and pretty much anything you ever wanted to know about the Alexander technique. So, Imogen, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you. It's very interesting.